Welcome back, horror fans. Tonight I have a chilling tale for you that dives deep into the heart of a haunted high school, Black Hollow High. Picture this: a crumbling relic at the edge of town, shrouded in fog and dark secrets. For decades, students have whispered about the forbidden West Wing, the site of a tragic fire that took the lives of several classmates. But what happens when four curious friends decide to challenge the ghost stories? As Halloween approaches, their dare to explore the abandoned wing turns into a terrifying nightmare they never saw coming. Get ready to immerse yourself in this spine-tingling adventure where laughter mingles with whispers, and the past refuses to stay buried. Can they escape the darkness, or will they be trapped forever? Grab your flashlights and settle in. This is a story you won't want to miss. Black Hollow High School stood at the edge of town, a crumbling relic from the 19th century. Its massive stone walls and towering windows loomed over the fog-choked trees, and the long-abandoned West Wing was a forbidden zone for students. For decades, rumors had circulated about that part of the school, a fire that had claimed the lives of several students in the early 1980s, a tragedy the town never quite recovered from. Though the rest of the school was renovated and remained in use, the West Wing had been sealed off, left to rot in its dark secrets. For Sarah, Calvin, John, and Mary, Black Hollow was simply their high school, with all the usual teen drama and boredom that came with it. None of them had ever given much thought to the stories about the West Wing, until the night they decided to explore it. It was nearing Halloween, and the entire school was abuzz with stories about the supposedly haunted section of the building. Some said you could hear the laughter of children who were never found after the fire, while others claimed they had seen figures staring out from the broken windows late at night. But none of them had ever dared to venture inside. That Friday night, after the football game, Sarah proposed a challenge: spend 1 hour in the West Wing and film whatever they found. It was meant to be a harmless dare, a fun way to spend the evening and a chance to debunk the ghost stories for good. Calvin was hesitant, but John and Mary, curious and slightly amused, agreed. So they snuck back onto the school grounds, armed with flashlights, a video camera, and bravado they didn't quite feel. They found their way to the rusty metal door at the back of the West Wing, hidden by overgrown ivy and piles of debris. To their surprise, the door wasn't locked, as though inviting them inside. With a push, it creaked open, and a cold draft of stale air greeted them, carrying the faint smell of smoke and mildew. The air seemed thicker here, almost oppressive, as though the building itself held its breath, waiting for something. The inside was a stark contrast to the rest of the school. The walls were charred and peeling, the floors warped from years of neglect. Old desks were overturned, scattered across the rooms like skeletons of a forgotten time. Papers, long yellowed and brittle, were strewn across the floor. Silence hung heavy in the air, broken only by the soft creak of the floorboards beneath their feet. They wandered through the first few rooms, nervous but excited. Nothing seemed too out of the ordinary. The windows were shattered, and graffiti covered some of the walls, left behind by students from years past. But the further they ventured, the colder it became. Sarah, leading the group with her flashlight, noticed the temperature drop sharply as they approached what appeared to be a hallway leading deeper into the wing. Suddenly, Mary stopped, her eyes wide with confusion. She had heard something faint, like a whisper carried by the wind. The others heard it too, a soft, indistinct murmur coming from down the hallway. They froze, exchanging nervous glances. It could have been the wind, they reasoned. Old buildings made strange noises all the time. They pressed on, but the murmurs grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't just wind. It was voices. Faint, distant, but undeniably real. Children's voices, giggling and whispering. Sarah glanced back at the others, her face pale. They had come too far to turn back now, though fear gnawed at the edges of their minds. The hallway led them to a set of double doors, marked by old, rusted plaques that read classrooms 3B 3D. As they pushed the doors open, the voices stopped abruptly, plunging them into an unnerving silence. They stepped into what must have once been a large classroom. The chalkboard still clung to the far wall, though it was cracked and covered in dust. Desks were overturned, and in the center of the room was a large scorch mark on the floor, a remnant of the fire that had ravaged the wing decades before. Suddenly, the temperature in the room plummeted. Their breath hung in the air in front of them as a thick, unnatural cold pressed in from all sides. The room darkened, despite the beams from their flashlights. The hair on the back of John's neck stood up, and instinctively, they all huddled closer. Then they heard a soft, rhythmic tapping, like the sound of footsteps. At first, it seemed far off, but slowly, it grew louder, as if someone was walking toward them from the far side of the room. But there was no one there. Calvin shined his flashlight into the corner where the sound came from, but all it illuminated was the emptiness. The footsteps didn't stop. Panic surged through them. Sarah moved to the door, trying to push it open, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if the building itself was holding them inside. The footsteps grew louder, faster now, circling them. Mary let out a small cry as the feeling of cold hands brushed against her arm, though no one stood beside her. The whispers returned, louder, clearer. This time they could make out words, faint, chilling phrases that sent a wave of terror through them. "Come play with us," the voices whispered. "Don't leave us. Stay forever." John pointed the camera in every direction, but it was as if the darkness itself swallowed the light. His hands shook as the temperature dropped even further, his breath coming in quick, panicked bursts. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to move, shifting and elongating, almost like figures, creeping closer and closer. Suddenly, the door flew open with a violent slam. Without hesitation, they bolted out of the room, running back down the hallway toward the exit. The footsteps followed them, echoing in the distance, growing fainter but never disappearing completely. When they reached the door to the outside, they shoved it open, spilling into the cool night air, gasping for breath. As they stumbled away from the building, they looked back one last time. In the window of the classroom, silhouetted against the broken glass, stood the faint outline of a figure. It watched them in silence, as though waiting for them to return. They didn't stop running until they were far away from the school grounds. None of them spoke on the way home, the weight of what they had just experienced pressing down on them like a shroud. They never returned to the West Wing again. But sometimes, when the wind was right, and the air was still, they could still hear the faint sound of children laughing. And every now and then, late at night, when they closed their eyes, they could still feel the cold grip of unseen hands. After that night, things changed. Sarah, Calvin, John, and Mary tried to go back to their normal lives, but the events in the West Wing clung to them like a dark shadow. At first, it was small things. Calvin would wake up in the middle of the night, certain he'd heard footsteps outside his window. Sarah began having vivid nightmares of the figure in the classroom, always watching, waiting. John's camera, which he had used to film their exploration, mysteriously broke the next day, its footage corrupted beyond repair. But the worst was Mary. A few days after the incident, she became withdrawn. She stopped coming to school and refused to answer any calls or texts. When Sarah went to check on her, Mary's mother said she was bedridden, claiming she had caught a fever. But Sarah knew something was wrong, something far worse than just an illness. One night, while tossing and turning in bed, Sarah received a text from Mary. It was brief. "Help me. I think they're here." Sarah's blood ran cold as she read the message. Without thinking, she grabbed her coat and hurried to Mary's house. When she arrived, the house was unnervingly quiet. The door, strangely, was already unlocked. Inside, the air was thick and suffocating, as if the very house was holding its breath. Sarah called out for Mary, but there was no answer. She moved up the stairs, feeling a coldness seep into her bones with each step. She found Mary sitting on her bed, her face pale and her eyes distant. She was staring at the window, her body stiff, as if she were frozen in place. Sarah rushed to her side, but when she touched her, Mary's skin felt icy, her lips moving faintly as if she was whispering something under her breath. Sarah leaned in closer, and that's when she heard the same words they had heard in the West Wing. "Stay with us, stay forever." Sarah jerked back in horror. Mary's eyes snapped toward her, wide and glassy, as though someone else was looking through her. "They're here," Mary whispered, her voice trembling. "They followed us." Before Sarah could ask what she meant, the room grew unnaturally cold, and a shadow slithered across the wall, dark and twisting. The door to Mary's room slammed shut with a force that shook the house, trapping them inside. Sarah felt it then, a presence, something unseen but undeniably there, moving closer. Desperately, she grabbed Mary's hand and pulled her from the bed. "We need to get out of here," she yelled. Together, they ran for the door, but something was wrong. The shadows in the room began to stretch, reaching out like tendrils, clawing at them as they stumbled toward the hallway. The cold breath of whatever haunted them was at their backs, whispering in their ears, "You can't leave, not now." As they reached the stairs, the lights flickered, plunging the house into darkness. Sarah's heart raced as they ran down, nearly tripping over each other. The front door came into view, but before they could reach it, a sharp, agonizing wail filled the house. The door slammed shut, the lock twisting on its own. And then, silence. Sarah's hands trembled as she tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Mary collapsed to the floor, her hands clutching her head as if trying to block out the whispers only she could hear. The shadows seemed to gather around them, darker and denser, as though preparing to swallow them whole. Desperation clawed at Sarah's throat. She screamed for help, pounding on the door, but the sound was swallowed by the oppressive air. They were trapped. Whatever had followed them from the West Wing wasn't letting them go this time. Suddenly, Mary stood up, her body moving stiffly, as though she was being controlled by invisible strings. Her eyes glazed over, her mouth moving silently. The shadows crept closer, and the air around them thickened. Sarah grabbed her friend's arm, shaking her violently. "Mary, snap out of it." But Mary didn't respond. Instead, her eyes fixed on the staircase, and she began to walk toward it, drawn by something unseen. Sarah pulled her back, her own fear boiling over into panic. "No, we have to stay together." But Mary, her face slack and expressionless, pulled away. She started up the stairs, moving as if in a trance. With every step she took, the shadows followed her, growing darker, more menacing. Sarah called out to her, but Mary was beyond reach. Just as she reached the top of the staircase, the house shuddered. A loud creak echoed through the walls, and a deep, inhuman voice whispered from the dark, "You belong to us now." Without warning, the shadows surged forward. In an instant, they wrapped themselves around Mary, pulling her into the darkness. She didn't scream. She didn't fight. She simply disappeared, as though the house itself had swallowed her whole. Sarah stood there, frozen in shock and terror. The whispers faded, the air lightened, and the house grew silent once more. The door, which had been sealed shut moments before, now stood open, swinging slightly in the night breeze. But Mary was gone. The next morning, Sarah couldn't stay silent. She told Calvin and John everything that had happened. At first, they didn't want to believe it, how could they? But when they saw the vacant look in Sarah's eyes, the shaking in her voice, they knew it was true. Something had followed them. Something from the West Wing. The three of them made a pact. They would return to Black Hollow High. Whatever had taken Mary had come from that place, and if they didn't stop it, they feared it wouldn't stop with her. Late that night, they broke into the school again, retracing their steps back to the West Wing. This time, the air felt different, thicker, darker. The building seemed more alive than before, as if it had been waiting for them to return. As they entered the West Wing, the temperature dropped instantly, and the faint sound of children's laughter echoed through the empty halls. Sarah's heart raced. Calvin held the flashlight, his hands trembling, while John carried a crowbar, though none of them knew what good it would do. They reached the same classroom as before, where it had all begun. The door was slightly ajar, as though it had been expecting them. Inside, the scorch mark was still there, dark and ominous. And standing in the center of the room, barely visible in the shadows, was Mary. Her back was to them, her head slightly tilted as if she was listening to something only she could hear. They called out to her, but she didn't respond. Sarah stepped forward, her voice shaken. "Mary, we're here to take you home." Slowly, Mary turned around. Her eyes were hollow, empty, her face expressionless. But there was something else, something behind her gaze, something ancient, cold, and malevolent. The room grew darker, the shadows coiling around them like serpents. And then, in a voice that wasn't her own, Mary whispered, "You shouldn't have come back." The building groaned, the walls closing in. The darkness surged toward them, swallowing the light, the laughter of the unseen children growing louder, more manic. And before they could react, the shadows consumed everything. No one ever saw Sarah, Calvin, or John again. Black Hollow High remains abandoned to this day, its West Wing sealed off, though no one dares to investigate what lies within. The townspeople speak in hushed tones of the missing students, but no one can explain the strange sounds that sometimes come from the old building at night: whispers, footsteps, and the faint echo of children's laughter.